You are about to see John Young speaking at the UC Santa Cruz Kresge Town Hall on Thursday, October 23rd, 2014. The event was hosted by the UC Santa Cruz Common Ground Center, Education for a Just and Sustainable World. To find out more, visit kresge.ucsc.edu/common ground.
Well, here we are, midway through the first half of the quarter, and as you know, the themes of this amazing class are the Great Turning and Nature Connection, and I'm so pleased to welcome my dear friend John Young to Kresge Town Hall yet again to weave context and these themes together. We're recording this talk tonight for people who aren't here, so I'm just going to say a few things about Common Ground and the class for those people who are joining us through the World Wide Web and through this audio recording. So, Common Ground Center, we're in our third year at UC Santa Cruz, and we weave together social justice and sustainability. We have a lot of great programs for undergraduates like yourselves, classes in nonviolent communication and restorative justice, peacemaking, nature connection, gardening, permaculture, essentially the skills that the next generation of leaders need to build a just and sustainable world and to facilitate the Great Turning. So thank you all for being a part of that. We focus very much on intergenerational collaboration and co-mentoring, where elders and younger adults and children are all working together to move this world in the same direction. We have an amazing speaker series that's free and open to the public, and a lot of cultural events. We have our Ancestor feast coming next week that we're going to talk about. And also we have a new event coming up 2 weeks from yesterday called the Barn Dance. And we're going to turn Kresge Town Hall into a barn, essentially. And John and other friends are going to come and play music. And we're going to have Andy Wilson, dance caller, in here and just try to pack the room full of, hootenanny dancing folks. So stay tuned for more information about that. And, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over, I think, to Marge. Oh, right, tribal breath and all that. I can't forget. So, gosh, I met John in 2004 up the coast in Pescadero, and I was studying tracking and permaculture and just ran into Penny Livingston and John at Duarte's Tavern up there. And many years later, I enrolled in a program called the Art of Mentoring, which was about 150 people camping on the land, practicing tracking and bird language, and also really village building, right? We call ourselves a giant learning village in here, and do some wild things like what we did in the meadow last week, and yesterday or Tuesday in the Kresge Meadow. And it was just completely wild. 150 children and elders and adults just running around playing games, and it felt so good. It felt like it was tapping into some of my DNA, the deeper part of what it is to be a human being. And it was completely timeless. And so I went on this journey with John for the next few years of really working intensively to help build this global movement for peacemaking and nature connection and cultural mentoring called the Eight Shields. Eight Shields Cultural Mentoring Movement. And part of that journey was to collaborate with John and another friend, Mark Morey, and a bunch of other folks on this thing called the tribal breath. And it was this vision of getting communities connected around the world, these nature connection communities in Scotland and Idaho and up in Canada and all around the world, all hosting cultural festivals together at the same time. So we did an Ancestor feast. Not the same exact day, but within the same couple weeks. And we each in our communities would facilitate an Ancestor feast and then share the stories of how it went afterwards. Because, sometimes breaking away from business as usual takes a little bit of energy, and it's a little scary, and it's a little hard to take leadership. So these phone calls, this thing, the tribal breath, was really helpful for us to support one another, to take the leap that we needed to take to actually be bold and create culture and create community in the face of capitalism and business as usual and, the busy calendar and everything. So we did that for 2 or 3 years with tremendous success, and had a springtime festival, we had a summer abundance festival, our fall Ghost Supper, Ancestor Feast festival, and in the wintertime, this ceremony, the Renewal of Creative Path, which is what John's going to actually come back in the winter to share stories about in January. So I want to encourage you to enroll in this class again next quarter to continue deepening this learning journey. And we are also looking for people who want to be course assistants next quarter as well. So, okay, with that as some context, now I'm going to pass it to Marge to introduce John.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited that I get to introduce my good friend John Young. I thought I would share a gift with you guys. It was the first gift that he gave to me, and it was this story about weird, and you can correct any of the details if I get them wrong. But he had a friend who tracked the word back, I believe, to its Irish roots, and weird literally means connected. When I found that out, my mind was just kind of like blown. And now whenever I say things like, oh my gosh, that's so weird, I'll be like, oh, that really is weird, because it's connected. So now you guys get to do that. So yeah, with no further ado, here is John Young.
Thank you. I don't know, can you hear me okay through this lapel mic? Is that working? Yeah? I don't know who's got the volume power to turn me up if they need to, but please do if you want to. You know, we are recording this on my iPhone so that I can broadcast it tonight to several hundred people in that same network that Dave mentioned. And, you know, for that reason, everybody say, hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. That's, I don't know, 150 or so people saying hi to you. And they can't say hi back, but I know they will, and they'll be wishing that they could. We are continuing in the same pattern that Dave was talking about earlier, and I think we've counted over 300 communities worldwide that are doing what we call culture repair, and using universal elements that predate westernization, that were found on every continent where humans were common. So that means not Antarctica, for instance. But everywhere where people were common and where they had a continuous history, we found commonalities in certain patterns that people were following. And we drew the conclusion that, and this goes back into 1980 or so when I was doing anthropology, if everybody used to do this stuff, it probably means it's good for us, right? And I had a set of criteria I was working with as an anthropology researcher, and one of them was can't be used for war purposes. So anything that we were gathering wouldn't be used for acts of war or anything that would bring harm to another person. So that was one of the things we were doing. And essentially, let's just say, used for peaceful purposes. If I found it on at least 3 continents, I called it good to go. And what we did was we lifted these things out. We looked at how different people in different places did these things. We looked at what seemed to be the operating principles behind it. You know, why are they doing this? How is it done? And then we said, can we, you know, essentially call it universal? And if we could call it universal and we could run it at an all-boys Catholic high school in the after-school program, then we did, just to see what would happen. So we were field testing cultural elements on these unsuspecting New Jersey boys. And, you know, to our amazement, the effects were profound and healing and deepening. And so we just began testing them on other populations, and including, I ended up working in New Brunswick, New Jersey at a program for younger siblings of substance abusers who were at high risk for repeating the patterns of their older siblings. And these were not nature-connected children by any stretch. You know, they were living essentially in concrete, and they had very, very small attributes of nature connection. You know, for instance, we would walk down the sidewalk with these young people in their own neighborhood, and there'd be pigeons on the sidewalk, you know. And this was before screen time, so it wasn't like they were on their smartphones. They literally, this is before that era, okay? So you can't blame it on their iPhones, right? They're walking down the sidewalk, and there's pigeons, and at the end of the sidewalk, the pigeons have had to move out of our way as we walk by them. And we got to the end of the sidewalk, and we'd get around the corner, and we'd ask them, what did you guys see back there along the sidewalk, you know? And no one saw the pigeons, right? And we began to realize that even when pigeons flew up and away from them, there was no eye tracking of the pigeons. There was no body response to the sound of their wings popping, nothing, you know. So I do a lot of that kind of work where I'll expose people to things and then ask them questions later to see what they perceived. Because what they perceive is a sign of what they're connected to, and it's an indirect measurement, but it really works. And what we discovered was that they had very little nature connection to draw from. And we began to draw a correlation that as they developed stronger and stronger nature connection, and they began to see the pigeons, and they began to ask what they were, you know, the other thing that changed was these social, emotional health and intelligence factors that they were being pre-tested and post-tested from this thing. So they were found to increase quality of life measurements in all areas, right? And it was a lot of the stuff that I'll be introducing one particular topic tonight, the Ancestor feast, as a common phenomenon, but they were exposed to all these various cultural models. So we called this approach cultural mentoring, and we started our first official project in 1983 in New Jersey, and then now today, in 2014, there's over 300 projects worldwide, and we're being invited to new countries all the time to get this rolling. So it's kind of cool stuff. And it's especially cool when things are happening like here tonight, because I live on the west side. It's really nice to just have to go a few minutes and come up here and be immersed in your presence, and to know that you're all learning these things and hopefully going to go out there and create some mischief for the future generations. One thing I'd like to say about these cultural elements is that these are tools that, if you ever ask any of the cultural facilitators within a culture, why are you doing it? You know, they might say in the beginning, well, we have to do this in order to honor our ancestors. Or we have to do this because it's springtime and Grandma always makes us do it in springtime. That's why we're doing it. But if you get deeper into conversation with them, you'll hear that the reason they're doing it is for the future generations. So everything we do is for the future generations in cultural mentoring. And when we pass things forward, we're trying to leave the world better than we found it. And we live at a time now where the legacy of postmodern Westernism, whatever you want to call this thing that we're calling Western culture, but I'm going to downgrade it because it's not Western culture to me. It's Western society, and there's a difference, as you'll hear in a minute. You know, Westernism is tracked by some people, people from the Haudenosaunee community, Akwesasne in New York State, who are the Kanienga Mohawk people. These are Iroquois people, or people of the Longhouse, as they know themselves, Haudenosaunee. One of their speakers, John Mohawk, he edited an address that was given to the United Nations in Geneva in the early 1970s. And this was a unified message from the Grand Council of the Haudenosaunee to the United Nations and to the world, which basically said, what if we looked at Westernization not as a story of progress, but actually a story of a sickness? You know, how would it appear if you looked at it from that lens instead? And then they tell a very compelling story of the loss of traditional ways, which kept people united to each other and to their ancestors and to the unborn, and also kept them in good relationship with one another and the natural world. Because that's what these cultural elements are about. And so the book is called A Basic Call to Consciousness. If it's not on your reading list, it should be. A Basic Call to Consciousness, and it's edited by John Mohawk, but the publisher is Akwesasne Notes, which is AKWESASNE. And you know, the book is, I don't think it's much more than 80 pages, but it's 80 of the most simple words that are the most compelling story of how to look at what I'm going to call our modern dilemma. You know, there's a lot of things about the modern world that I know we all enjoy, right? One thing that I'm really enjoying right now is that I'm recording this right now on this thing that's also my phone and also my camera, and, you know, so many other things, which I'm sure a lot of you, if I asked you, would raise your hand and agree you also like your smartphone. Well, let's see, who likes their smartphone? You know, so our modern life has given us some amazing things. And the other thing that's really amazing is when I'm done, I'll be able to just send this recording onto the internet, and it'll go out through an email, and all of a sudden, a couple hundred people around the world are suddenly going to be tuning into what's happening in this room and uniting us in a certain spirit, right? So modern experience is giving us some incredible gifts, and probably not a moment too soon, because sometimes I feel like we live in a Star Wars episode, and, you know, and that the Death Star has to be blown up before it destroys us all, you know, and we're right at this final moment, you know, and the only thing that's going to save us is synchronicity and total bravery and total creativity and unbridled willingness to just jump in and do whatever has to be done, right? It's kind of how I feel like we're living at that time. So these tools are ancient tools, but they're also super simple to work with, and they immediately create well-being, and they improve quality of life the moment they're applied. Okay, so I sort of framed a little bit about where I'm going tonight, and where we'll go again when we come back in January. So I hope you come back. The other piece I want to share with you going into this is that let me just show of hands if you've heard of Richard Louv. Okay, so Dave, you got to fix that. So Richard Louv, maybe one of the most influential people of our times in terms of changing policy in Washington, D.C., and he has created, with the help of the Children in Nature Network, an incredible groundswell of world interest. I think now something like 80 countries are involved in this conversation that's basically saying human beings need to be connected to nature to be healthy. Human beings need to be connected to nature to be spiritually centered and feeling like they have a meaningful existence. He wrote a book called The Nature Principle, and he basically, in that book, describes vitamin N. And he talks about the fact that, like humans need vitamin D, and they need water, and they need air, they also need vitamin N, which is a certain critical mass of nature connection in order to be as high-functioning as we are capable of being. And he's not saying that from an opinionated place where that's his idea. This is backed by the research of thousands of people. This is not like just an idea. Huffington Post recently, out of the UK, an author there penned an article that basically said that nature connection is the next big human trend. And I do hope that it's not a trend. You know, trends come and go. This can't be a trend. Richard Louv's book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, he coined that phrase, nature deficit disorder, and popularized it then. People actually were going to their doctors asking if they could get health insurance for it. And at first everyone thought that was amusing, and then later on, all of a sudden, now you can. So this disorder is actually not a single disorder, but it's a collection of symptoms that are directly related to nature disconnection. And when people get reconnected after experiencing nature disconnection, the symptoms go away. And that includes everything from certain spectral autism conditions, ADHD, all kinds of things that have to do with physical, emotional, mental health. A lot of research says that we as human beings are more creative, we're happier, we're healthier, a lot of things around basically quality of life when we have a certain degree of nature connection, okay? So, anybody worried about the future in the room tonight? Like, worried about what's going to happen on planet Earth and what's going to happen to all the animals and the birds in the air? And, yeah, a few of you? Okay, good, most of you. So, have you heard of the Audubon Society, National Audubon Society? So, 100 years ago or so or more, they formed this organization which basically was a bunch of people who love birds getting together to do things to help birds have a better chance of surviving. And really, especially through the middle of the last century and into the turn of the century, Audubon, built a network of millions of people who donated money because they love birds. They donated time because they love birds. They donated expertise. They pooled their networks and resources, and they joined the boards for the different chapters. There's 480 chapters in the U.S., and there's a national Audubon that unites all the chapters to the best of its ability. And these communities are active. Raise your hand if you're a member of the Audubon Society. I have been for a long time, and I became involved in the Audubon Society when I was 15 years old, which was 1975. And there I met these elders who sat patiently all day long at these places where hawks were migrating, and they pointed at different hawks, and they taught me how to identify them in the distance. And, so as a teen I had these elder mentors who were birders. So when the Gulf oil spill happened recently, everybody remember that one? 133,000 volunteers were mobilized through Audubon networks around the Gulf, and they hand-wiped oil off birds for days and days. Right? This is heroic stuff. I mean, they're not getting paid to do it. There's no government agency directing them to do it. They've collectively, with the power of their philanthropy, donations and money, have given hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to conservation, to buy land in Costa Rica and other countries, and to deal with all the international politics to make sure that when the hermit thrush flies south from Santa Cruz, it has a place to winter over, right? This kind of stuff that people were doing. These are just citizens. You get that, right? What's happening with Audubon now is that as these people age out, as they get too old to do birding trips anymore, and they're not active anymore, they don't renew their membership anymore, and maybe they're going to pass away. And as they're aging out, what's happening to Audubon membership is it's shrinking, right? The average population in Audubon is getting older and older, and the size of the pool of people who are involved is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And the problem with this is that means conservation dollars are also shrinking, right? And this is true for all conservation organizations across the world right now. As people are aging out, the young people are not coming in to replenish the numbers. So did you hear that last point there? As the elders are passing on from conservation, there's no young people filling in the bottom. Okay? Why is that a problem? Where is the millions and millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of man-hours going to come from when there's nobody doing it anymore? And Richard Louv sounded that alarm and basically said, maybe that's the scariest thing about the loss of nature connection, is that our population is no longer actually taking action of their own initiative as volunteers to actually do something about it, right? And Richard Louv is going to town hall after town hall, the country department of this and that, having meetings with high-level people all over the world saying, wake up, people, this is a problem. And now at all levels of government, there's big policy changes, there's big things happening in education. For instance, in Canada, an organization called Evergreen has replaced 3,000 playgrounds made out of concrete and asphalt, torn them all up, and planted natural play spaces designed to actually attract children. They're actually designed by psychologists and landscape architects to actually be friendly habitat where children feel safe to connect to nature on their own. So Richard Louv is inspiring this kind of, activism, right? How do we reconnect our people to nature? And in as many ways as possible at all levels of education. So, the reason I bring him to your attention is because he's got the megaphone and he's out there shouting, we need nature connection. Everybody needs it, everybody. That means all of us in this room. As you're going to hear in a minute, you're going to see why these are connected. We need it because if we don't have it, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we're losing. We don't know what we're not connected to, and we don't care for those things in the way that they need to be cared for, and that's a very dangerous situation for humanity. Very dangerous. I mean, there's already lots of other things to make it dangerous for humanity, so this is really a great party that we're all been invited to at this time in history. But can I say this, that every big conservation organization, Department of Interior programs, education interpretive programs, U.S. Forestry, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Audubon Society, they're all rewriting their mission statements now to include nature connection for all, in a certain sense, kind of what it says, right? And what they don't realize is that nature connection doesn't come from education. And one of the things that I've been doing around the world, I'm constantly traveling now, fortunately and unfortunately, to help people understand that you don't read about building biceps to make your biceps bigger, right? You don't study bicep building in order to get bigger biceps. But what we're doing with Nature Connection is exactly that. You know, we're applying an educational approach and trying to get a nature connection outcome. These are two different things, as different as lifting weights than reading about lifting weights. They're that different, right? And what we're now understanding is that we have a educational information skills transfer model that we utilize in society. We're in one right now. It's pretty well supported. I don't feel like this building's going to fall on us anytime soon. The lights are working, the sound system's working, the educational industry is very well populated and really robust, and there's a ton of great research and there's amazing people leading it, right? So education is doing just fine. However, education doesn't seem to be able to solve the connection problem, okay? But it's going to try anyway, as it is. The recreation world, that's the second quadrant of relationship with nature, so we can have skills, information, and the competencies that come from education around, say, ornithology or dendrology or anything that helps us understand about nature. That stuff's covered. We don't need it to be improved. We have recreation for nature that is also doing great. If you go down to the West Cliff Drive right around now with all the swells that are happening, you see a bunch of people surfing, you see people stand-up paddleboarding, you see people walking their dogs. You're basically looking at a $1 trillion industry that is also flourishing. We don't really need more for recreation. It's taking care of itself, right? The next quadrant is nature connection. And it's the most misunderstood quadrant, and it's also the one that is not, as Richard Louv said in a recent keynote in San Francisco, even though everyone's throwing around nature connection as a big word now, and they're all putting it in their mission statements, the needle is not moving. You're not seeing attributes of nature connection any greater than before people started trumpeting, and that's because we're trying to use recreation and education to do something that requires an entirely different process. And that brings us to tonight. Because the process that most effectively governs nature connection is actually culture. It's neither education nor recreation. And culture is a highly misunderstood word. It has all kinds of alarm bells around it. And when you mention it in the wrong way, in the wrong context, activism starts to jump to its feet, and all this stuff starts to happen, and polarities start to occur, and But I think that's because people are focusing not on what culture does, but people instead try to define what culture is. And what culture is doesn't interest me. It's what culture does that interests me. I'm interested in culture as a verb, not as a noun. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is tools from culture that are actually cultivating connection between people, themselves, and nature. Okay? So that's an important definition for you to know, that culture isn't what it is, because if you look in Wikipedia and you look up the word culture, it goes on for 60 pages, and by the time you're done reading it, you'll know less about culture than when you started reading it. Because it's really all over the map, and there's nothing clearly stated about culture that at any point actually helps you understand what it is, right? It's what it does that matters most, and that's what we want to talk about tonight. Culture works best when it connects. Culture works best when it connects. The job of a culture is to connect people to themselves, to each other, and to nature. So in that frame, I will now point out to you that the Western world is actually brilliant at disconnecting people. It's a weed whacker for connection. It basically, you are born into a system that turns on a weed whacker, and you start getting all your connections cut from the second you enter the world, and everything that happens within our institutions from that point on is disconnected, right up the line. And we are constantly bombarded with disconnected forces. And as children, our cultural internal compass is longing for the things that are supposed to happen, because for a million years we existed with culture, and there was these things that happened. Your grandma had a certain longing, and you had a certain longing, and that longing came out, and your grandma's longing met, and they locked hands, and lo and behold, connection was held, and like a midwife for connection, it took place. And everywhere you turned, that happened. And all around us growing up, when we were disconnected, there was people looking and saying, oh, Bobby just got disconnected. Better throw her over to the healer. And then the healer would know exactly what to do to reconnect Bobby and heal the disconnection moment, right? There was everybody. In fact, some cultures are so strong that every family has responsibility to make sure there's healers within it to restore broken connection when they happen, right? That's a strong culture. If every family takes responsibility to make sure that every family can restore connection when it's broken, that's very redundant. And that means that, maybe great auntie over here, our elder auntie, has the power in the family right now, but she's already training her nephew and 2 nieces to replace her. So that means whenever there's a cultural disconnected moment, there's 4 people working on it. But because children are growing up watching that happen, they're instinctively learning how to reconnect on a smaller level, a smaller scale, and they're sort of doing automatic culture repair as it happens, because humans actually have the strong instinct to heal connection when it's been broken, unless it's been beaten out of us. Okay? When culture is beaten out of people thoroughly, and that maybe take 2 or 3 generations, 2 or 3 generations might span, 40 to 60 years or something like that, right? The offspring from that culture, did this thing just die on us? What's that? Yeah, it's gone to sleep, Dave. I think the battery died. When, I got this thing here. So in cultural systems, we like redundancy, right? Redundancy emphasizes importance, they say, in cultural mentoring. So if after 60 years there's a cultural loss, all studies basically show very clearly that the generations that follow won't know how to put the culture back, right? And then if 100 years passes by in that region, that means 100 years later the culture's still gone. You with me? What happens when you take the European continent and you spend 400 years wiping out culture without stopping? The Dark Ages. What's the end result of that? And that is what the book, A Basic Call to Consciousness, is looking at. What if the loss of culture is actually a sickness? And sickness begets sickness. Just like, abuse goes down family lines. Somebody's abusive here. This generation is abusive. This generation is abusive. Things humans do, both positive and negative, pass through family lines, sometimes unseen. Right? It's part of who we are as humans. It's part of what makes us who we are. And so I put forth the idea, I'm not even going to call it a theory, maybe some people would call it history. I'm putting forth the idea that maybe what we're living in is a giant form of amnesia, and that what we call Western society is actually a giant form of historic trauma that has institutions that keep it going, right? But it's actually historic trauma being passed down too, not just cool techniques of science and technology, There's other things being passed unseen, and they live within our institutions. There are organizations worldwide that are waking up to this problem, and one of my recent clients to actually build cultural mentoring into their corporate structure is a very large international bank. And they're actually developing cultural mentoring tools to build teamwork and human well-being, not just company well-being, as a service to the employees and what they feel is a give back to the community. They're actually healing culture through their corporate culture. So as much as sometimes we think that the corporations are the big problem, I do think that the for-profit corporate system has a better chance of nimbly responding to the need of culture repair than institutions do. Because I also work with big institutions, and a very big educational institution on another part of the planet that has taken 5 years to even agree on one simple question about what we can do. with or without a cultural mentoring approach. And there's all kinds of internal disagreement and problems of tenure and problems of politics and all this other stuff, right? But this bank is very nimbly saying, if we can get this to work for this team of 36 managers, we're going to put it out here for 120 next, and then we're going to use it company-wide, and that covers an entire country, right, with tens of thousands of employees. So I'm personally excited about that possibility, that companies are looking at this and saying, wow, we can do something with this, right? The other thing they've realized in another company I'm working with, they're basically saying, well, wait a minute. We noticed that when we apply these models, everybody's happier. They come to work happier. They report a happier home life because they're actually not going home stressed out. They're going home in a more peaceful state of mind, and they're having more positive influences in the household. We think this is good for the company, too, because people are excited about their jobs, right? And they like working here, and so the spirits are high, and the creativity is increasing. So I just want you to know that this is not just the work of edgy activists that we're talking about here, okay? This stuff is landing and rooting all over the place, and thank God. Not a moment too soon. So yeah, this talk is all about weird, quoting back to Marjorie, you know. Weird, which really relates to wired in a certain sense, you know, connected. And so when things happen because we're connected, they tend to be outside the realm of all mechanical understanding. Sometimes things happen because of intuition, and then we go to the right place at the right time, and something happens, and then we say, weird. Right? But now there's all this evidence that basically says that as smart as our conscious mind is, our unconscious mind is so much smarter and so much faster at processing, and it's using the mirror neuron system to read, for instance, the language of birds. You know, we can read the language of birds intuitively because our ancestors had to for centuries, millennia, because there was large predators that used to feed on our ancestors. And it was very important that we knew what the birds were saying because they would always tell us where that predator was. And if we were listening to the birds, they would give us early detection. You know, so I like to go to Botswana these days and spend time with the San Bushmen who still live directly in relationship with African lions in wild lands with no houses and no fences and no cars to hide in, no guns, you know, they're just on their feet. And I'm fascinated by the fact that their children, from the very youngest age, when a bird alarm goes off, all the children turn their heads at once and look in that direction. That impresses me. If I go back to the concrete story earlier, right? The children who don't even perceive birds at all, let alone pick up the nuances of communication, right? I just want you to be aware that you are literally hardwired for this. And that when you activate that hard wiring, you're happier and healthier. You're more vital. You have better listening skills. You have more empathy, you have a sense of innate helpfulness, you know what your gift is and you're calling to help the people, you're in deep service, you love life, you have a deep appreciation for it, you love other people, you know how to forgive, you know how to forgive yourself, and you have a quiet mind. All of those are good attributes. And I have never met anyone who's received those attributes from reconnecting to nature who's basically said, give me my old self back. Never said that, right? They're like, yep, that's what I want, all that. The other thing I like to say is if you could imagine your neighbors with all those attributes, think of how cool your neighborhood would be, right? And if Joe's right, and we have a big solar flare right now while that giant sunspot is aimed at the earth and our grid goes down, right, and we have to rely on each other, I would rather that you all had the attributes if you're my neighbors than not, because then we'll have a much higher chance of surviving a difficult transition period. And we might even be able to invent how to make transformers locally quickly and get our grid back up. But maybe we build a different grid this time that isn't so susceptible. But however you look at all that, I'm making a case for looking at culture as something that you can all influence in a positive way if you understand what it does. Okay? And it connects. So if you review the last 24 hours and you say to yourself, what happened in the last 24 hours that was really connective for me, that left me feeling more connected after it happened than before it happened, you know, what jumps to mind? And then if you go back through the last 24 hours and you look at things that disconnected you from other people, what goes through your mind? And did you have more connective or disconnective experiences in the last 24 hours? Raise your hand if you had much more connective experiences in the last 24 hours than disconnective. That's a good sign. Raise your hand if you had much more disconnective experiences than connective in the last 24 hours. Okay, and then the rest of you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. So let's look at the phenomenon of the ancestor honoring feast or the ghost supper, and let's dive into it in detail as a cultural mentoring phenomenon that appears all over planet Earth with all people that I have been able to interact with and hear stories from. I discovered that this feast exists in the high country of Innsbruck, Austria, up in the Tyrolean Alps. There's forms of it that exist in Ireland. There's forms of it that exist in Germany. I found it in Polynesian culture. I found it throughout North America, all over North America. And there's different forms of it in Africa among different tribal groups, and there are definitely forms of it among the San Bushmen, who are sort of the original African inhabitants, the oldest ones, going back since the big ice sheets melted off Africa. They've always been there. So they're what they call themselves, the sons and daughters of the first people, literally the first people. And you'll find similar patterns in Australia. They become a little less recognizable over there, but the point is it's all over the place. It's ubiquitous, right? It's there. Now, the other thing you find is that in the Northern Hemisphere, this interesting phenomenon that is shared right across the Northern Hemisphere. We call it Halloween today, right? Catholic Church has named All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, right, which has become a position marker for what was across the entire Northern Hemisphere among cultures all over the northern half of the globe. Okay, and around this time of year where we are right now, today being October 23rd, last I checked, that right around now, a phenomenon is occurring in the Great Lakes tribes and up into Canada called Ghost Supper, Jibigajik in the Anishinaabeg language. And what's happening in these neighborhoods is really fascinating, What's happening is that people are preparing their favorite ancestral foods. Okay, so these are foods that grandma and grandpa who have departed, who are now ancestors, really loved when they were alive. It was their favorite food, And they're making this food with love. The whole family's getting together, and they're basically getting into the kitchen, and they're cleaning the house, and they're making it really nice because grandma actually might come and visit early, while you're cooking. So make it beautiful for her, and they decorate with the things that she used to love, and they put pictures out, and they make sure that she's represented, and grandpa's there, and other ancestors that have passed on, they bring memorabilia, they set it up, and the whole family lovingly prepares this feast. And what they prepare the feast for is not just the family. So let's say there's 8 people in the household who are working together to create this meal, right? They're going to make food for 75 people in huge pots. And what they're going to do is they're going to send a couple of the family members out into the backyard, and they're going to actually make a fire in the backyard. And they're going to kindle that fire with flint and steel because they can't use matches or lighters. They have to go direct. They need a connection with spirit, if you will, in order to get the fire lit. So if the fire doesn't light, that means something's off. So they pay attention to how the fire communicates, whether it wants to come or not. And they have these very skilled people who understand what they call the sacred fire or the connected fire. And they have this place in the backyard set up, and they put chairs all around it, and they decorate it. The daughter and the mom will make this beautiful wreath of colored flowers from the landscape all around the fire pit, and the boys will be splitting the wood and getting everything ready. And the fire will be burning. They'll light it with flint and steel, as I said, and then the fire will be burning long before sundown. And they'll take the first plate of food from the pot, and they'll bring that plate of food out, and they'll put tobacco in the fire, and then they'll put the food in the fire, and then they'll put tobacco in the fire again, and they're feeding the ancestors that food. They're actually inviting them to come. Please come, sit at our fire with us tonight. But it gets even more interesting. So now what happens is the family goes inside, and they eat this meal together with plenty of space before sundown so they can relax and enjoy a family meal together and think and tell stories of grandma and grandpa and just otherwise visit and connect, right? When the meal is done and they've finished eating themselves, they then set tables in their living room. They carry their living room furniture out, and they put folding firehouse tables all around the living room, and they have folding chairs all over the place, and they make their living room handle 30, 40 guests. And guests know from the neighborhood to put on their sweatpants because they don't want to have a big belly pushing up against their belt. So they put on their sweats and they put on their t-shirts, and they go over to this family's house at sundown. And instead of coming in the house, they go to the sacred fire. And at the sacred fire, they put tobacco in the fire, and they greet the ancestors of that family, and they greet their own ancestors in the fire, because when they light the fire, they ask the ancestors to come down through the fire and hang out there around the fire. And then what happens is, while you're sitting there visiting at the sacred fire, one of this family's ancestors jumps on your back, so to speak, and when you come in the house, when they come out and say, hey, we got a table for 8, we got 8 people ready to eat, yeah, we're ready. So these 8 people leave the fire. Every one of those 8 people may be carrying an ancestor from that family's lineage in their bodies, like they just jump in. And so when the family greets those people at the door and welcomes them to the home, they're greeting them as if it's one of their long-lost loved relatives that is now deceased and on the other side. And so this totally beautiful thing happens, right? And maybe it's all symbolic, but maybe it's not. It's hard to know with culture, because culture is tricky. It's working with us in a below-language kind of way. It's working with our connection system, not our intellect. So it isn't about belief, and it isn't about faith, and it isn't about ideology. It's about how it connects us. And so what happens is, when someone comes to the door and you greet them as if they're a long-lost relative, and you go to hug this man, right, as if he's your long-lost relative, you smell your grandmother's perfume. And you hear her laugh in his laugh. And you suddenly get tears in your eyes, and you're like, oh my God, my grandma decided to come in with Joe, right? But at the same time, there's this humor, and there's this love, and there's all this weird stuff happening, literally, like weird phenomena are occurring around this thing, and you're just like, am I imagining this, or did that just happen? And then you welcome Joe in, who's also your grandma, and you sit him down, and then you feed him with love. Here's your favorite meal that we've prepared for you. Right? And the bonds that build between the people on this night, I've never experienced anything more bonding than Ghost Supper. It's one of the most powerful connective ceremonies I've ever experienced, bar none. And people laugh, and they joke, and they tell stories, and they cry, because of love. They miss somebody, so they just tears of love come up, and they get misty-eyed, and they get choked up, and it's all from love. And it's the most beautiful thing. And at the end of the night, which could go late, what happens when this party of 8 is done eating? They get up, they walk out the door, and they go down the street to the other neighbor, because they're having a ghost supper tonight too. And they do it all over again, which is why people wear sweatpants. And there might be 4 or 5 ghost suppers in the same neighborhood. Does that sound familiar? Sound a little bit like trick or treat? Like it's like sort of you can see where trick or treating is sort of coming from. It's like this spirit of the autumn holiday, when everybody's honoring ancestors by feasting them and remembering them. People are going from house to house and being fed and hosted as if they're ancestors, right? And then of course you have all these other amazing celebrations that are, the Day of the Dead. It's huge in our area here, right? The same kind of phenomenology is going on around that. Over in Akwesasne, you go over there, and they have the Dance of the Ancestors. And once a year, for one night, all of the people in the neighborhood come to the community center for a dance. And on that night, they invite their ancestors to come in, and whoever your dance partner is probably one of your ancestors. So you kind of figure out, who am I dancing with tonight? And you have these special dances which were a favorite. And it has basically the same effect. It builds this enormous bond. Everyone remembers the people that spawned their parents or their parents' parents, who we all love and remember with sweetness in our heart. And that causes all of the living people who are left behind, those of us who live in the lighted world, as they say, all of us who are still on this side of the dirt, we we're left with two feelings. One, we really miss and love our ancestors. And two, we know we're going to not be here forever. Because our mortality just every year has to come and visit. And you can't help but think about that. When you're sitting at the sacred fire waiting for your turn to eat, you can't help but think, one day I'm going to be in the flames, and it'll be me that's coming to visit my unknown great-grandchildren, right? And they're going to be feasting me. And there's this feeling that comes over you where you suddenly appreciate the fact that you're alive at a whole nother level. And all these switches turn on, and your heart gets bigger. You know, like the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. You know, like his heart grows so many different sizes at the end in that cartoon. You feel that happening. You actually feel this physical sensation of your heart growing and your vulnerability increasing, and it's not morbid. It's not a morbid fear of death, but it's a recognition that life is precious, really, really precious. And when you start to feel that life is precious, you start dealing with your children differently. You start dealing with your neighbors differently. You become a better human being by being exposed to these things, because these are cultural tools that connect us. Can you see where we're talking now tonight? You know, the realm of connection is not the realm of thought and ideology. It's not the realm of mechanics and logistics. And it's operating at a whole different level, but it takes advantage of the best of what it means to be a human being. And there's another great book actually called, I think, On Becoming a Human Being, which was written by a traditional elder from through an author from the people in Syracuse, the Onondaga people, and his official position name is Taradaho, and he figures prominently in the Great Law of Peace as the Speaker of the House in the story of the Haudenosaunee. But Chief Leon Shenandoah, who bore the traditional title Taradaho, writes at the end of his life his memoirs on becoming a human being. And he's talking very much about the realm of connection and why it matters. And so this idea of ancestor honoring, we have programs all over the U.S. and Canada that are based on H. Shield's cultural mentoring modeling. One of them is the Rikers Center for Human Enhancement out of Menlo Park, California. They run a program called Rikers Nature, and they operate out of the Arboretum here on campus. Raise your hand if you've been involved with these guys at all. Raise your hand if you've bumped into totally mudded up, completely camouflaged people who mysteriously appear when you're out on walks. So you've encountered them, and maybe they've actually seen you, but you haven't seen them. They're actually learning from and emulating the wildlife around campus, and they're just doing really fun stuff for all ages, mostly focused on children's programs. And these two feral children over here are my two youngest, Finch and Willa, who are involved there on Tuesdays at the Arboretum. And they're better off for the existence of such a framework to grow up in. My goal as a parent is different than most parents. My concept of education is keeping them in the attributes of connection. Because my oldest is 31, and he grew up in this cultural mentoring model, and he came out so happy and healthy and brilliant. At 31, he's so on top of the world. He so loves what he's doing, and he's such a powerful leader. But his formal study was not formal study. It was connection. And he's a very empowered person as a result of it. And I saw what it did for my oldest, and so the youngest are immersed in nature connection as often and as I possibly can help them be so. And they count many aunties and uncles in their neighborhood who are not blood relatives of mine. These are people who understand cultural mentoring, and we're doing culture repair for the sake of the children, right? And when you meet these children, when you see them, you go all over the world and you go to H. Shield's programs, you'll see the same kind of thing going on. And when you get to see them transition through their teen years, they don't actually go into this depressed and rebellious place. That's a function of disconnection. When teens don't feel honored and recognized, and they're not met in the way that they really need to be met, then they really give up hope on the adults altogether. They just lose hope. And they go into a dark and cynical place, and they become very rebellious and very anti-authority, and a lot of intense stuff happens, and they're very difficult to work with at that point. Raise your hand if you were one of those teens. Yeah, I had a feeling, yes. I was one of those teens also. And, when I studied the attributes of connection, I began to believe that, okay, children have these attributes, and then they lose them at the teen years. And then when they discover what they really want to do when they grow up, you know what I mean? They find the career that suits them, they find the meaningful path they were looking for, then the attributes start coming back. So there's like a cycle. They start out with the attributes humming, drops off during the teen years, gone for the adult years for a little while, and then they return if and when they find their meaningful path, right? But my sort of observation of Western society is that a lot of people don't actually find that. So it's a small percentage of adults who get back to that really happy place. Which is sad, isn't it? I think it's sad. So then I went and spent time with the San Bushmen, and I'm looking at, children from infants, pregnant mothers, infants, all ages of children, right through the teen years, young adults, adults with young children, adults with older children, grandparents, and great-grandparents, all together at the same time. And I could not find anybody at any age who lost the attributes. They had the attributes at the youngest age, and they had the attributes of connection throughout their entire life. And to my surprise, and to my total curiosity, somehow their teenagers didn't have a look in their eye that our teenagers have. They actually kept soft faces, and their smiles stayed loving and innocent, and they had this sort of openness and sweetness to them. And I never saw a single teen with bitterness at all, not one. And then I began to think, well, maybe there's hope. Maybe it isn't about teens. Maybe it isn't about something that has to happen, right? And I really tried to understand, how is this possible? And is there something we can learn from that? Is there something we can lift from this group of people, and would they be kind enough to share it with us so that we could virally spread it throughout the Western world so that the teens don't have to become bitter, dark, and enraged and hopeless? And we found that the answer was simply everything that we were already doing. Everything we asked about it, everything we observed, everything we researched, everything we tested were all things that we were already doing. And we just figured out that we need to strengthen certain things that we're currently not doing so strong. Because there's a certain sort of, resistance from the world around us to try anything that isn't by the book or already researched and what have you. But as one of my friends told me who's in the publishing world, she was saying, John, you shouldn't really shrink back from this, because if you wait for science to catch up, right, even if you begin to have groundbreaking studies right now, it'll probably be 30 years before the mainstream culture catches on, because science is very slow at proving out things, and then society is very slow at responding. And that really you should just go boldly forward with anyone who's willing, and just keep doing this stuff, not because you need science to back it up, but because it needs to be done, right? And so that has been the work of thousands of people around the world who are actually playing with this stuff to try to improve the quality of life for themselves and their family and their neighbors. And, Common Ground, Dave and everybody here who's working on this project are early adopters of something that is as yet untested, unproven, except that it's as old as we are as human beings. So it's very much proven. I think what we're really looking at is just sort of entrenched thinking and sort of a social sleepiness that's the result of thousands of years of historic trauma all intersecting what we call America. And what I'm feeling is that, with a playful, innocent, and curious spirit, you can do a lot with cultural memory, and you can have a lot of fun with it. And so Reich's nature proved that to me, Because even though Ken Clarkson, the director of Rikers Nature, has been at a full-on ghost supper, Jibigajik style, with Anishinaabeg people, he's experienced it and he's felt the power of the full thing. Do you know what I mean? That really belongs to the Anishinaabe people in the way that it's done. But he started to think about it, well, what would be a simple version of this? And he just wrote an email to all the parents who have to come for the annual fall potluck for their kids, right? And said, okay, this week at the potluck, you're all supposed to bring a favorite dish from your ancestors and a story about that dish and be ready to tell it to everybody else there and share with each other. When you get there, not only food, but story, right? And to his amazement, that simple act right there, right? How hard was that for me to tell you about? You probably already know it. You can go home and do it tomorrow, right? Nothing tricky about what I just said. That he says that is the single most connective activity that the families experience all year. And what's supposed to be like a 2-hour potluck, no one wants to leave. It extends much later, and people end up talking and crying and laughing. And he said bonds are built between parents and children on that simple potluck that are unrivaled throughout all other activities in the rest of the year. And through Tribal Breath, which you heard Dave talk about earlier, we decided to then just give this recipe out, the one I just said, to people all over the world and encourage them to go out into their neighborhoods and just try it, their style. Whatever works in your country, in your neighborhood, with the people you know, just make something up that kind of fits the rough criteria. Tell people to bring their favorite ancestral dish, share it with a story, invite them around, decorate the house, whatever, put pictures up of ancestors, whatever you want to do, just keep it simple, make it fun. And people did that. And I'll never forget this one gal from Ireland who said, oh, this will never do. They're never going to come to this, she said, They already think I'm weird. It's great, right? And when I try to bring these things up at the family reunions and things like that, they're always turning against it, and they cold shoulder me. And I can tell you right now, my uncle's not going to come. My neighbors aren't going to like this. It's different. It's too different than what's going on, she's saying, And I said, well, just try it. Take a risk. Invite those who you know will come and that it's safe for you to invite. Don't kill it before it starts, Well, we worked with her for a couple of months there to get her ready. And she did it. And when she came back on Tribal Breath and told the story, everybody cried on the phone listening. Because she said not only did everyone perk up, because everyone has a favorite ancestor recipe. Everyone does. Everyone has a favorite ancestor, right? Every single person related to it. And it was almost as if they were remembering that their ancestors used to do this. Samhain, right? It comes from Ireland. It comes from those people. Halloween is actually drawn off that pattern. They remembered something. It woke something up. And she said people had so much fun that night, and they didn't want to leave. And the stories were coming out, and the songs were being sung, because, oh, Grandpa loved this one song. Don't you remember that one? And somebody's bursting it out and singing it, and everyone's singing along, and people are all crying and laughing. And everyone said that was one of the best nights they could remember, right? And she said that ever since, all those people who were kind of treating her as the weird black sheep were suddenly really much more open to her and saying, when are we going to do that again? Right? That's the healing right there, isn't it? That's culture repair. That's happening right in that story. And it was a simple matter of offering a favorite recipe from an ancestor and sharing it, bringing it over as a potluck dish, right? And opening the space for whatever wants to happen. You can do it. I do think that you're all going to have one of these things coming up soon. Isn't that right? This Tuesday. All of you. Wow. You going to wear your sweats? You better. That's going to be a lot of food. I'm excited. This Tuesday, and I'll be out of town. Darn it. Well, I'll expect good stories from that, now that you know what's at stake. Anyway, these little things held in a, let's just say in a routine, they're throughout the year, a healthy culture has multiple opportunities for routines like this to occur. And what happens every time something like a ghost supper or an ancestor feast happens, which only happens once a year, a certain amount of healing happens within the greater community. Can you see that? spontaneously. People aren't going knowing that they need healing. They're going to have a good time and to share food. And they might even be going feeling like, oh God, I got to make an ancestor dish. I'd much rather be doing this or that, and then they show up and they have this really powerful cathartic experience and all this healing happens. And, the architect of the Great Law of Peace, who's known as the Peacemaker, basically said that people need this about once a month. They need some major pulse of cultural healing at least once a month. And so he mandated in the Great Law of Peace, I love this, that it's, by law, all families are required to take part in one really fun Thanksgiving festival a month. And they all have responsibility. The children will have responsibility, the parents will, and the grandparents, and everyone will know their role going into it, and they'll throw a big Thanksgiving festival once a month for a different excuse, each month. And his notion was that, and I guess we can't really say what his notion was, but what Jake Swamp, who's now an ancestor, he was one of the sub-chief of the Wolf Clan for the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation, so he was one of the 50 Grand Council chiefs. What he explained to us when he explained this thinking was this routine of cultural impulse, these pulses of cultural connection that happen once a month in a strong way. What that did was it exercised all the systems of communication and love and healing within the greater community. So if someone had a death in the family, for instance, everybody's all primed and ready to respond. So the community is more resilient because of it. It's like, you got to have a sacred fire every time you have one of these festivals. Well, it turns out that the sacred fire is also used as a funeral fire. So if somebody dies, the fire is burned in the backyard of the family house where someone has passed on for 4 days and 4 nights, continuously fed round the clock by volunteers. Food is brought to the people who are tending fire. Every morning the fire is renewed with beautiful flowers, and every morning at sunrise and every evening at sunset, 4 songs are sung that honor the deceased, and at sundown 4 songs are sung, and people, they mark the passage of the day and the night for 96 hours. And at the end of the 4 days, most everybody in the family has had a chance to come to the fire and to sit at the fire and to talk to the deceased person through the fire and grieve and cry, and if they had any unfinished business with the person who has left, right, they could express it at that point through their prayers to the fire. Very powerful tradition. But if the community doesn't practice regularly being supportive of each other, then when the family has a loss, then the family doesn't get supported because people are kind of scattered all over the place and their connections are all broken, So his idea was, I guess his vision about this great law of peace was that it should be mandated that every family participates in these monthly ritual gratitude feasts, dances, and big Thanksgiving rituals, always based on some excuse that nature's providing. So this time of year was the Feast of the Ancestors, the Dance of the Ancestors that I told you about. In the spring, when the first strawberry is ripe, they know that the children get really happy when the first strawberry ripens, and so they always pick a strawberry queen and a strawberry king, if you will, and they go and they select the strawberries, and they bring the first ripe strawberry in, and they make a special drink from it, and then they have a strawberry festival, and everyone brings strawberry dishes together, and they all celebrate all the berries and all the good fruits of the earth through the strawberries, and when the maple, check it out, when the maple trees start to give their sap, and they can make maple syrup and then make the maple sugar, that's one of the favorites of the year. Can you imagine that? You notice who these festivals are aimed at? Right? They're all aimed at the children. And they're aimed at the children because if the children are really happy, then the parents are really happy. And if the moms are happy, everybody's happy. It's pretty much how they look at it. So they do everything with that in mind. And they created this rhythm around festivals, which is very enlightened. They basically said, well, Strawberry Festival's coming up. We got to get ready for it. So all of the people in this family, the women all need to meet over here and talk about what they're going to do. The grandmothers, the moms, the aunties, the daughters what are they going to do at Strawberry Festival? And then all the men are meeting over here, and they're going to do what all they're going to do. And then the faith keepers are meeting over here, the ceremonial planners, the artists, the musicians. They're all planning what they're going to do. And they usually have a potluck or a feast around their meetings. And so they have to have a meeting before the event, then they have the event, and then they have to have a meeting to debrief the event. So now how many are we talking about a month, right? They're sending out these pulses rhythmically through every turning of the moon to make sure that people are practicing cultural things that build connection and strengthen connection as a year-round cyclical phenomenon. And that's a very powerful, very enlightened structure. And I do wish that the laws of our land included those kinds of things. You know, it would be a different country if we were all asked to celebrate as family by family the return of the wild strawberry, or the return of the salmon to the rivers, or the acorns dropping from the trees, whatever it would be, that we would be thankful that nature is still doing what it has always done for us to keep us alive. And that there's teachings within each family. Each family is responsible to make sure there's a good storyteller who can tell the stories to the children so they even know why this matters, you know, and that these stories keep us connected. You know, and these are stories of culture in action. You know, next, in January, when I come back, okay, good. When I come back in January, I'm going to be sharing about another really, really powerful cultural phenomenon, which is all about helping people discover why they were born. You know, find the ultimate meaning in their life, and the various teachings and cultural patterns that you find around the world that support people to figure out their unique gift that they are coming to offer the world, you know. And in reflecting back to these people who operate out of the Great Law of Peace, you know, one of the things that they talk about is that when you sign in to the Longhouse, and, you know, when you're a kid, if your parents are in the Longhouse community already, then you're already in because you're a child of that parent, right? So you get automatic enrollment, if you will, right? But when you come of age, and you're now a free-thinking, free-wielding, you know, potential citizen of the Longhouse community, you have to be invited back in. So they kick you out. And then you have to earn your way back in by going through these various conversations with key elders in your community, and you have to more or less convince them that you really understand what it means to be somebody within that community, you know, how to uphold your responsibilities, right? One of the things that you commit to is that whenever your eyes fly open in the morning, you'll find something to be thankful for. It's one of the laws. It's a good one. Imagine being arrested for not doing that. And who's actually going to know? But these lighthearted cultural laws are really important, you know. If you wake up in the morning and you don't know why you should be thankful, or if you're not feeling thankful, that pretty much indicates to the elders and to the healers of your community that you have a disconnection issue going on. And what they're going to do is not put you in jail for disconnection. They're actually going to put you through some kind of a process that restores connection. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute to kind of wrap the night up. But one of the things you're committing to is, yes, I will always start my day with gratitude. And any time I get together with an important purpose with other people, we'll always remember to be grateful so that we can get ourselves into the right mind. So that when we get into the right mind, the decisions we make will be for the children who can't defend themselves from our decisions, right? They call that the 7-generation principle. I know you've heard of 7 generations if you go to New Leaf, right? Laundry detergent and various other products with the 7-generation name on it. They actually quote the Great Law of Peace on their label, if you've ever noticed that. But the 7-generation principle is basically saying what we're doing is for the future generations. So if we're going to do something important, and it's going to really make a difference in the world, and it could affect other people, our decision could affect other people, then let's make sure we use gratitude to start our meeting so that we can get to the good mind and remember the importance and the sacredness of life, so we can really take care of the right things and leave something that the future generations will be glad we did. Right? So that's the 7-generation principle. So you're signing on to that when you sign back into the community. And this isn't the last one, but this is the last one I'm going to talk about. What are the commitments when you come back in the door? One of them is this, and this is one of my favorite cultural mentoring tools in the universe. Basically says, it's believed that every human being who's born is born with a gift, and that gift is not for them. So each one of us in the room, if that's true, has something inside of us that we're meant to share with the world. But when we share it isn't necessarily about us. As a matter of fact, the reason it's called the gift is because it's for everyone else but us. So when we live within our gift, we're helping everybody else. Okay? And that, of course, gives us a life of meaning. And it gives us a life filled with grace, really. I mean, a lot of beautiful things happen when people find that path for themselves, and they'll tell you that they have a meaningful life and they really enjoy their days. So if you are as old as me, you might remember the Charlie Brown Great Pumpkin episode. You know, and Charlie Brown goes door to door with all his friends, and they say, "Oh, I got this candy," and "Oh, I got this candy," and Charlie Brown looks in his bag and he says, "I got a rock," right? So there's this symptom of disconnection that they recognize there in this community that basically says, some people will say, "Oh, you know, Dave got a gift and Marge got a gift, but I got a rock," right? I don't get a gift. I don't have one. Everyone else has got one, but I wasn't given one, so I was skipped when they were giving them out, right? Which is one of their alarm bell symptoms. If someone feels that way, then they really need to be supported. You know, they need to be loved and held and given the space so they can actually explore their gift. But they really believe that a healthy society is at its best when every person gets to express their gift. And that when every person is fully expressing their creative power and their vision and their gift, then everything is just taken care of, right? It's actually the cheapest form of governance there is, because everyone's taking initiative to take care of each other. You know, you're not relying on services to do things, you know. So they consider it a cultural and national priority to make sure that everyone gets to explore their gift. What does it mean to explore your gift? How do you do that? What does it even look like, and what is a gift? Come back in January and I'll spend some time on that very idea. We'll look at it from many different parts of the world, and we'll look at that phenomenon. But let's just go back to the priority of this traditional nation to make sure that every single person has a gift expressed, or an opportunity to have their gift expressed, okay? And let's look at how they make that happen as a structure of society. They don't have the Department of Gift, where you go in and make an appointment to have a gift counselor meet with you for an hour to help you figure out what your gift is, right? They don't do it that way. They do it like this instead. Okay, 18-year-old, you're almost ready to enter the Longhouse community. We're almost going to let you back in, but we got to ask you a question first. You know, do you promise to step into your responsibility to look for the gift in others? Because you may be the only person alive who was given the gift to see the gift of one individual. And what if you were the one who saw the gift in that individual and you didn't help him express it? You know, what loss would there be from that? For that person and for our greater community. And you, really too, you. You know, are you prepared that it may be your gift to be the only person with the gift to see the gift of one other person? And you're the only one who can see that gift. Are you ready for that responsibility? You know, and what does that mean? Well, imagine if you said yes to that, and then you just walk around through life with this giant question mark hanging over your head like, is it you? Is it you? Right? Already, all of your interactions are going to be different, you know, because you're already poised to listen for things that you wouldn't have otherwise listened for. right? Culture's tricky that way. There's a lot of what we call trickster transformer stuff in cultural mentoring. Coyote or Iktomi, the spider, or Mbuku, the hare in Africa, or every single culture has a trickster spirit. And the trickster is there to transform people, because if you leave it up to people to transform themselves through their own intellect, it never goes well. In fact, it never goes at all. Because when it comes to transformation and connection, our intellect is more or less poised to stop us, because intellect loves control. And connection yields transformational experience, which is out of control in that regard. So a lot of cultural elements are tricking our intellect into relaxing and surrendering so that our connection system can actually be born. If you look at what causes nature connection to occur, and let's just use nature connection, because I could say, if you look at what people connection, what causes people connection to occur, you can actually draw total parallels between nature connection and people connection, okay? But I'm going to look at nature connection for a second, because there's so much cool research about that. And basically they say it's pretty straightforward. People have nature connection when the following things are true, okay? They had timelessness in nature. They had no adult supervision. They had no one telling them what to do or how to do it. They simply lived according to what they were feeling in the moment and explored according to their own curiosity and their own desire to move or not to move, right? They had a creek where if you looked out the kitchen window, Mom couldn't see it, because you could go down a little hill and then she couldn't see it. And Mom knew where you were. She could whistle you in, so she felt safe that you were there. You felt safe being there, but you were also really stoked for some reason to be just out of sight of Mom, right? And all of the social surveys around people's nature connection history, they all talk about this experience of, well, yeah, we all used to play as friends away from our parents without any supervision, and we were self-guiding. We did what we did. We tested our own limits. We climbed trees. We got to the heights that we were comfortable with. We jumped out of trees because we saw the older kids doing it. We took risks, but we always took risks according to where we were at. And for some reason, we didn't die. And the injury rate for kids doing this on their own is actually surprisingly low. Even they do things that if the mom was there, she'd freak out, right? Which is why they have to be away from Mom, because on an intuitive level, on a longing level, below the level of intellect and thought, they know in their bodies they need to get away from the adults so that they can take the risks they need to take in order to develop the connections that they're born to have. And those connections are not just sort of subtle empathetic connection with life. These are also connections with their own body in three-dimensional space. They begin to understand and feel and know how their body moves and the nuances of what works and what doesn't work within this thing called your body. Nature is the best teacher for that. It's, 24-hour fitness for human wellness, And it's free and it's available, but it's only accessed by people who are given timelessness and unsupervised time, which today, 2014, scares the daylights out of parents, right? They don't believe that their kid will be safe. They don't believe that, it's a good use of time, right? What do you mean, timelessness? You want my kid to wander around unstructured? What's that doing for her or him? What kind of job are they going to get from that? There's this kind of thinking going on right now, right? But a lot of evidence says that some of the strongest leaders in our world today, in all sectors of society, share a common story, which is that they had nature connection in their background. So there's a lot of evidence that basically says nature connection unleashes the leader in us. Because we were risk takers that understood our own boundaries and balance when we were young, we learned to do that confidently as adults, right? Also, they say that nature connection yields creativity at a higher level also, and better problem-solving skills. So all this points at the connection process what's required for connection in nature is the same thing that's required for connection among people. Timelessness, the ability to explore without supervision, right? You can reflect on relationships that have formed that are really strong in your life right now because you had timelessness and no supervision. You were able to really just go where you both felt comfortable to go in your conversations, and lo and behold, bonds formed that are lifelong friendships. It's no accident. You can basically set up conditions in nature connection programs that essentially simulate all of that very easily using cultural mentoring, and all of a sudden two things are happening. Lifelong friendships are forming, and deep nature connection is occurring. Right? Has it got you thinking? So I want to end, because I promised I'd end with one quick thought, and that is the Bushmen. I'm going back to the San Bushmen, and there's a researcher and an author by the name of Bradford Keeney, and he wrote a book called Ropes to God, which he actually wrote by going to 60-something Bushman healers, men and women in their 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, who were the traditional healers for the San Bushmen, all over Namibia and South Africa and Botswana. And he gathered their stories through a translator, and they were the ones who invited Brad to do this. And they sent him from village to village, and they would tell their friends at the next village, please tell Brad everything, And when Brad was done getting all the translations done, he went back and read what he was going to write in this book back to all of the people who were left alive. And they unanimously approved the manuscript. So he calls those 10 years, the 10 years when he was the secretary for the San Bushman healers. And the book Ropes to God is fascinating to read. And then the other book that's really fascinating is Bushman Healers, which is two works that came out of the same editing process that Brad used. And the Bushmen tell this story about, when you build a relationship to the little bird that's outside your front door in the morning, when you look at that bird and you take a second and you recognize it and that bird recognizes you, you make eye contact for a second, you have a kind of a communication through body language and eye contact, that a tiny thread will form between you and the bird. And that tomorrow, if you see the same bird, the thread will thicken. And when you realize that that bird is the male and he sings from this tree and he has a wife and they have a nest and they have 3 children, then you start to recognize, well, hey, I have children and I'm raising my children too, and I can relate to this little bird because it's a challenge for me to raise children just like it's a challenge for those birds to raise children. The thread becomes a string, and over time the string becomes a cord and it becomes a rope. And they talk about this phenomenon that this is what we as San Bushmen do. We build ropes with everything. We build ropes with each other. We build ropes with the stars, with the moon, with the sun, with the rains, with all the animals and birds and the bushes and the grasses and the soil, and that's what we do. That's what it means to be San. Have ropes with everything, right? The book's called Ropes to God now, so think about that, what that means, right? And how they see that as the ultimate expression of all of these connections. You then see this great being that exists behind all of it. So this is their story. They basically say that the elders are the ones who are the healers. They always let the oldest healers lead because they've been around the longest and they know the most, right? So they give them authority. And so that means that when we're sitting with 30, 40 Bushmen, this one woman isn't saying anything, but she's the oldest woman present. When she stands up to speak, everyone falls silent, and everyone very respectfully listens to her. They really tune in, because whenever she speaks, she's going to have a gem. And they all know that, right? So they revere these elders. And so here she stands up and she speaks, and she tells a story. And she talks about, when somebody is mean to somebody else. If I wake up this morning and have a bad morning and I feel uncomfortable, and I'm kind of pissed about something, and I don't even quite know why, because I haven't really formed thoughts around it yet. But then my sister says something to me, and I snap at her, right? They say that what I do is I send a nail through the air, and it sticks in my sister's spirit. And it causes like a pain in her spirit. So what's going to happen now is that she's going to snap at somebody because of that. And so maybe she's going to snap at 2 or 3 people, and they're all going to get nails. And so what happens is, in the neighborhood, let's say we are the neighborhood, it starts somewhere, and then nails start flying all over the village, right? And within a couple of days, lo and behold, we've all got enough nails where we're all kind of pissed all the time. And as soon as the elders see that enough people are grumpy, then they have a trance dance that night. They light the fire, everyone comes together around the fire, and they play these old songs, and they sing these old songs, which are really polyrhythmic and kind of trip the mind into like relaxing, because you can't follow the rhythms, you can't follow the words, they're very trancy. Then what happens is the old healers get up and they start dancing. And when they dance to a certain level, the band hits the groove, a feeling of electricity goes over everyone's body like a good concert, right? This is just exactly what happens, because I've been at these healing dances and they're amazing. And all of a sudden, the oldest person just starts to shake, and then they go into this really deep trance. And then what they do is they go around to the people who have nails stuck in them, and then they pull the nails out of them, right? And they just dance all night until all the nails are either shaken from dancing, shaken out, or pulled out because they're stuck by the healer. And in the morning, everyone's in like this dog pile all around the ground. They all just kind of fall asleep on each other, and they all wake up loving, and they're all smiling again. Everybody's happy. But if they wake up and half the people are still grumpy, then they'll call for another dance tonight. And they'll just dance until all the nails are shaken out, right? And that's their way of reconnecting, because they recognize that the ropes get damaged or broken between people, and they have to be put back again, right? So think about everything that we've talked about tonight as ways in which we can restore the ropes between us. The ropes between us and each other as human beings, between us and the natural world, and us, the ancestors, and us, the future generations, and ultimately us with ourselves. Uncovering our gifts and shining out again. And that's where I'll leave it now. And, thanks for your attention on this, and I hope it's got you thinking differently about maybe something you can bring out there to make the ropes a little stronger in our neighborhood. What do you think? Yeah. Right on. Cool. I can... Thanks a lot. I can take one or two questions probably, and then we'll have to dismiss you guys. Yes? Can I bring this microphone over to you? Is that right?
Yeah. It's kind of a specific question. Do you have any suggestions for where to go, resources for ritual or children's stories to start sharing with children?
Okay, YouTube is awesome for stories to share with children. If you research traditional stories, look for a guy named Johnny Moses on the storytelling question. Will and Finch and I listen to Johnny Moses stories. We really like to do that. That's a good place to start. And then rituals. Gosh, there's so much out there for rituals. I'm going to think on it a little bit. I'm going to send you something. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to pass it on to Dave. Do you know Dave? Does Dave know you? Yeah. Eye contact. Ritual. That's my homework. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead. One more question, maybe? No question? All right. Well, thanks again. And Dave, you want to wrap it up? Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to share a little story about the adventure we just went on. We got in airplanes and went to India and to the North Pole and then to the trailer park, which was really fun. And, just what a sweet story of cultural mentoring right here where, Willie just is like, let's go on an adventure because we have a relationship, and that sort of neighbor relationship that John was talking about earlier is just, in effect right here. And they were teaching me things about the forest. I was teaching them, and I'm just really excited for this Ancestor feast coming up. And you were in good hands the whole time. I knew that the show would go on without me in here. So, yeah, I don't know anything else to end with, but thank you for being up here and weaving the stories together. And let's have some fun on Tuesday.
Yeah.
All right.